filmmaker to look for the connections between things. And I really felt like watching both of your films, and given who you are, this would be a really inspiring panel. Because, well, let me say, Sasha made a film about Garry Winogrand, and if you don't know Garry Winogrand, he was one of the greatest photographers in the history of the United States, and really captured our United States. Xan made a film about Andrew Bird, which he's like one of my favorite musicians. It's called Fever Year. And so you have an artist who, and then besides that, I should say, Xan is Emmy nominated, Emmy winning? Emmy nominated for Transparent with Jill Soloway, and also has developed and is the executive producer of Room 104 on HBO. So there's a lot of insight that you bring that we can now mine and tap with Xan. And Sasha, I don't know quite as much about your background, but I want to say that I thought your film was fantastic. And I'm somebody, as a documentary filmmaker myself, who always films things that are unfolding, and I try to tell like suspense-driven stories. And I kind of dread the retrospective films, you know? And I make films more like Xan made with Andrew Bird. I loved your film.
Oh, thank you.
I thought it was just phenomenal. And so without further ado, why don't we show the trailer to that and kick it off that way?
Okay.
Okay, Garry Winogrand, All Things Photographable.
Garry Winogrand was one of the principal American photographers of his generation. He was a true poet of photography, a true poet of American life.
He took this genre of so-called street photography and turned it on its head and made it something new.
This guy shot over 1 million photographs in his lifetime, which is absolutely phenomenal when you stop and think about that.
Winogrand was controversial in his time and even remains so.
One of the things that's always really fascinated me about him is that he died with thousands of rolls of undeveloped film. What could that be?
Famously, there's a lot of nothing. There's a lot of pictures of nothing. But I discovered things in that nothing that people didn't know and still don't know.
You know, all kidding aside, I would like not to exist. You know, do I make sense to you at all? In the end, all I can do is wrestle, and whatever comes out, that's the way I have to express it. I would like not to exist. I'm not speaking in mysteries, and I'm not talking about suicide or anything. I just assume not exist.
He saw no other possibility for himself. This is what saved him from a totally anarchic life.
You have stated before that you like making films about outsiders and radicals.
Yes.
And Garry certainly fits the bill.
Yes.
But how do you bring to life someone who's gone and who died with thousands and thousands of rolls of undeveloped film?
Well, that was definitely a challenge because, as someone talks about in the film, there wasn't a lot out there. He didn't leave behind diaries or journals or letters even. There was some recorded media of him, a couple of interviews, an interview with Bill Moyers, and footage of him teaching that I found. But really the heart of the film was this kind of amazing the discovery that I made well into the research process, which was these audio cassette tapes that when he was living in Austin, Texas, his friend, the photographer Jay Maisel, came down from New York. And they were just hanging out in a diner, and Jay Maisel has a cassette recorder. So he's just recording these conversations. This was in 1975. And so it's this very, unstaged, raw media of just two old friends sitting around, shooting the shit, talking about their wives, talking about their ex-wives, talking about their parents, talking about their kids, talking about, trying to quit smoking. I mean, just all kinds of things. And that was really that's really kind of the heart of the film, is those audio cassette tapes.
Amazing, amazing cassette tapes. Yeah, and they bring you right there.
Yeah.
And now that we live in the age of podcasts, it's really interesting. The audio. And audio's everything to our films, right? At the end of the day, you can mess up the visual, but if you don't have the audio, you don't have the movie. Right?
Yeah, I know, it's true.
Yeah, and we're going to talk a lot more about it, but speaking of that, you have filmed a musician who is so quiet and mysterious. I have filmed him too. And he is so quiet and mysterious and sort of retreating and yet lovely. And he's also sick while you're filming him. He's like in a series of flus, right? Or something. He's like sweating and chills and fever.
It's an unexplained year-long fever.
Malady. He's like allergic to his career at that moment or something, or his life. And actually, I met him. He was also having a little bit of an issue. But I think that might be part of his process. Andrew Bird is incredible. And the thing about him is the show doesn't happen without him. It's every instrument in a way. He's looping things and he's creating. So sound capture must have been absolutely vital.
It was super important, and the show is the movie is based on 2 shows that we filmed at the culminating kind of end of a year of kind of at the end of 10 years of really touring, and so together he commissioned and owns the film. So together we picked out the person who would record the music, and it was really important to us that it was as pristine as possible. And then we went and made the documentary over the course of time. But when we went in to mix the music that's woven into the film, because it's a concert documentary, he was with me for the final mix, and he did all of his tinkering and all of his kind of careful work in there. And then we had the overall film. So it's like a film that the songs are edited by a certain editor, the music is recorded by a certain recordist, and then those were mixed, and then we wove those into a film that we edited and mixed.
I really don't think you could have a better sound supervisor than Andrew Bird.
Yeah.
Let's take a look at the film.
1, 2, 3, 4.
I was thinking about animals that evolve to survive in order to get through the winter, like a bear or a turtle. Maybe in order to cope with having to play for a bunch of people every night. Maybe my temperature goes up.
I was sick all year, pretty much. So I was freezing, I was whistling and shivering like a baby bird.
Have I simply been ill this year, or am I just turning into another type of animal? Most of my efforts are about trying to bring what happens here somewhere else. Just playing for the sheer joy of playing.
Sun is a wave like a wave on the ocean. Moon plays the ocean like a violin.
I couldn't wait to go over the Skyway, see the steel mills, and head out on the Ohio Turnpike and go on tour.
It was still fairly sensible. Bird never stopped, of course.
Comes and goes like it fits and dizzy spells like the weather. Blows like it knows what's going wrong, like it's clever. Has a name, but the name goes unspoken. It's in vain, 'cause the language is broken. So soldier off.
those notes and it's gone on to something else. And you just keep chasing that thing.
So, as an artist myself who's made several films about artists, the one thing that I think is really important is that we transcend the fan base and that we really get to the universal experience in the work of kind of the pain of creation, the elation of creation, the discovery, the connection, which you both managed to do, even though your subject had passed away. But tell me about, Xan, like when you're following Andrew, I guess he asked you to make the film, and he owns the film. So then it's a little bit of a different dynamic because sometimes, I don't know, when I've been filming, even Russell Brand asked me to make Brand a Second Coming, but then ran from the camera.
Oh yeah, it was 2 years of push and pull. You know, he's the worst audience for the movie, so I had to remember that. You know, like I might be making choices for the both of us that he can't participate in those moments. But also, he really wanted to capture what he did feel like he was coming up on a big life change and a big life leap. And I think, in retrospect, because this film came out a few years ago, like I think he felt it coming. But now looking back, like he was totally right. Like he'd played for a year and several years with this band. They'd been all over the nation. He'd gotten ill. But also, I wanted to do a couple things with the films. I didn't want to make a jukebox movie that like you saw once, and then you only go back to see the one song that you like. I wanted to see how close I could get, you know, to mixed results, I think, to never really thinking about whether you were watching a documentary or a live show, just have it woven. But also I wanted something that was like an introduction piece, because people who had been listening to him for 10 years were mad about him. They needed everything that they needed from this movie. I tried to like supply them, but also make an introduction. And so it was fun, because, you know, when getting into New York Film Festival was like a dream come true I never knew I had. I just applied through the front door and figured they'd chuck it into the street. But when the head of programming back then called to let me know I got in, he said, you know, I had never heard of him. I just really loved the movie. He said, but all of my staff were just like, are you crazy? We can't pass this up. And so I said, okay, good. That's what I was trying to do, is like introduce this person. But yeah, I mean, I think it was a nightmare for Andrew ultimately, but he wanted to capture these shows. And also, I just said, let me try and create something that captures where you're coming from so that you're free to go forward. And
I remember Russell apologizing to me and saying, I'm sorry that I'm treating you so badly when I invited you to this island, you know, referring to England. And, you know, but I just can't, I hate this thing.
Yeah, it's a
I hate
nightmare.
this thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to some extent, they actually hate their creative process. I mean, I think, and with Garry, it's the same thing. He was sort of miserable but addicted to taking photographs.
I mean, I think what you're describing feels really familiar, even though my subject was deceased, because Winograd was a really big photographer in the 60s and 70s, but he's not a household name by any means today. But so people who know him and know photography and love his work are very invested. They just love Winogrand. And then, of course, there's the family and the friends of his and so forth. So my goal was to make a film that they would appreciate and get something out of, but also that would introduce him to a whole new audience. Oh, excuse me.
Here's water.
Is there water?
And that you did. And I'd have to say, you know, when they say that the camera saved him from a totally anarchic life, it's like, and I felt this way with Andrew too, even though he's a very calm and quiet person, there's like there's like a seething, boiling pot of energy inside. And it's the music that saves him. You know, it's almost like maybe we make these impossible films because it saves us somehow. Like maybe that's
As
why
the
we
makers?
make our art.
Yeah.
And also, he didn't trust anyone. They're very similar in a way. He didn't trust politicians, Garry. He, you know, he really was. He did an assessment. He used his photography to assess the world that we live in, and he didn't like the results. And I always felt with Andrew and the little time I spent with him that he was anachronistic. It was like anachronistic with our world. He was out of sync. It was like from another time.
Yeah.
And some of the, you know, for example, there was no photoshopping in Garry's work. It was all authentic. Yeah. And I feel like Andrew, too, just doesn't like artifice.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Garry always printed full frame, so there was no cropping. Everything was the entire frame captured, and that was also something that was very important to the estate, that we always show every photograph full frame. So we cut into a few close-ups, but it's really mostly these kind of static images that let you meditate. So there are very few moves on the photographs.
Well, you did show the photographs, but then what's really cool is that I can't really see. I mean, sitting however far I am from a 75-inch screen, I loved it when you did pop in and you would pop back out. But one photograph in particular, there's a man lying in the street and there's a boy looking at the man, and all you see are the legs of the man and some blood. And so it was just this idea of kind of riding on the edge of everything falling apart that he put forth. You don't know if he knows the boy knows him or how any of this happened, you know? And what's funny is it actually reminded me of another thing that you do, which is Room 104. Because Room 104 is so avant-garde to be on TV.
And myopic. It all takes place in one motel room.
Yeah, it all takes place in one motel room. And I could interview you for an hour just about how you can pull that off. And you seem to have a stream of a lot of women directors. And as a woman showrunner, it seems like you're doing that on purpose, which is great.
We hired the best people for the job. We just happen to know a lot of lady directors.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And the Duplass Brothers.
And then in the end, we're like, oh, it's out of 12 episodes, I think it was 8.5 were directed by women, because one was a co-direction.
8.5.
Yeah.
That's great.
Or maybe 7.5, because it was just over half.
So what are the challenges of shooting in a single room?
Oh, so many. But, balanced. Shooting is on location or off location, in a stage, you just trade things out. But the fun thing about hiring different directors to direct different genres of different stories with different characters within the same setting is that we give them as much range as they like and as much auteurship as they like. So even in season 2, you'll see an episode that's shot completely different than any episode that's ever been shot before because of the eye of the director and what they've asked the DP to do. So, Mark and Jay created the show, and then I was brought on to develop and become one of the architects of the show. And so in the beginning, you just start to make the rules up, which are like what happens inside and outside the room, how magical is the room, how magical isn't the room. If we do a different genre for each episode, how do we balance those out per episode? So, and then bringing the filmmakers and the directors in, they're essentially, it's 12 episodes, but they're essentially like half-hour short films. Once you get your mind around that, then your approach as a director is just like, oh shit, I can do whatever I want. And they'll be like, can I pop out this wall? And you're like, yeah, we can take the ceiling out if you need. Does anything live in the walls? And we've already kind of decided what our parameters are. Or there were times that I would on set be like, this can happen, but this can't happen. But Mark always called it an exercise in limitations.
Well, it's funny, we share the same brilliant production designer, because my movie Mapplethorpe was production designed by the brilliant Jonah Markowitz.
Jonah for president.
Jonah for president, yeah, it's true. It's true. And directing versus producing? How was that for you? This was your directorial debut, wasn't it?
Which one?
Bird.
Yes, it was. Yes,
it was. According to your bio.
That's
which
true.
I read studiously.
Thank you. Yes. I recently crossed 40, and it's true. I don't remember anything. No, I remember everything. I just can't remember in what order. Producing versus directing, I always planned to direct ever since I was a teenager, or preteen, I think. I was either going to direct or join the CIA, so I got super obsessed with cinematography and photography in about 7th grade. But in high school, I became a producer. My high school had a TV show. My teacher decided that I was a producer, and I think it's probably because I come from a big family, so I'm used to having a group that needs to have something to do, someplace to pee, and something to eat, and everything on time. So I did that, and then in high school, I edited wedding videos after school as my job. The wedding gift was things I would cut out, and then
I shot. Actually, I shoot all my friends' weddings.
Do you?
I just can't. I can't show up anywhere and not film the thing.
Right.
I feel like it's my job as a doc filmmaker. I'm like, well, you, right?
Yeah.
I take pictures obsessively.
Back then, I didn't even know that I would ever have this long history in docs. Back then, I just had this job, and this guy would bring these tapes back, and I would cut them. But I always planned to direct, and I kind of always have. But in producing is like a stronger muscle, and it's bigger and louder. I always say that my producer me is the breadwinner for director me, because director me doesn't make any money. But I mean, sometimes, sure. But I have 3 music videos that I just directed. One came out last week and 2 come out. I'm finishing 2 others right now, so one comes out in April and then one in May.
Which bands?
It's for Nico Case.
Oh, I love.
So if you saw a video last week that has a bunch of snakes all over Nico, I directed that. And then we have
snakes.
They're real snakes.
How did
I
how
loved
do you
watching
get your
people
talent comfortable with that?
have it be her idea.
Okay, good.
And she grew up on a farm, so she was all over it. And we also worked with tarantulas for that one. But we made 3 videos, and each of them is completely different, which was a treat. So, yeah, it took me until my late 20s, almost turning 30, to find both sides of my brain. And I realize now that producer me takes care of director me, and director me keeps producer me excited. So I have a part of my brain that's really orderly and pragmatic and strategic and a good planner, and then I can be very far out. And now they trust each other. They didn't used to in my 20s.
Yeah, I always have produced what I've directed, so for me, always just, staying on budget. These things are just part of the creativity.
Right.
The limitations are part of the creativity.
Totally.
And Sasha, to bring it back to you, how did you start?
Well, it's so funny to hear you talk about this because our careers are really different, but I totally identify with what you're saying. So my background is really more as a sort of personal experimental filmmaker working in 16 millimeter. So I make films that are more in sort of a fine art context that might show in an experimental film festival or a museum setting, and then that's, as one might imagine, not very lucrative. So I have a career as a professor. I teach at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, and so it's almost like, the producer side of me is the side of me that can run. I mean, I'm a chair, so I run a department, and I do all of this sort of arts administrative stuff that I feel like working in film has kind of trained me to be able to do, because I have to be able to mobilize people and work with a budget and all of that, but then the creative side comes out in the more personal approach to filmmaking.
What do you think the films teach us? What's the takeaway, of Garry Winogrand? What does he mean when he says, "I would like not to exist"? And you include that both in the trailer and
it's how the film
It's pretty
opens.
preeminent in the film, yeah.
Right, and he says very clearly that he's not talking about committing suicide. So when he talks about not wanting to exist, I think he's talking about a way of creating images that are totally transparent, as if the maker weren't there, that you're encountering the image in a way that's actually completely not biographical. But yet his vision is so distinct and unique that when you see a Garry Winogrand, you know it's a Garry Winogrand. So in that sense, he failed in that project of not existing.
Everything's in motion. Everything is, and everything is full frame.
And he's also he's a very big guy. He's this kind of tall, big presence. And so I think he has this way of both taking up space, like on the sidewalk when he's out shooting, but also kind of being a little bit invisible because he's shooting so quickly, people aren't always sure. Did he take a photograph? Did he not? So.
And were you a fan always?
Yeah, so I was introduced to his work. I studied photography as an undergraduate in college, and so he's always been a really important artist to me. And I mean, in some ways, I made this film because when there was a retrospective that came out in 2013, it just sort of reminded me, like, oh, I love this guy's work. I haven't looked at it in so long. I'd totally forgotten about it. And then I wondered why there wasn't a documentary about it. And it was almost like I made a film because I wanted to see a film about Garry Winogrand.
See it.
Yeah, so.
And as women making films about men, which I've done many times myself, do you think about other men that you know? When you're, what is that dynamic like? I mean, for me, it's been different with different men, but sometimes it's maternal, sometimes it's like we're friendly, sometimes there's a sexual energy. In this case, you just mentioned he was big and he was boisterous, and he was, you talked to various wives of his over the time. So what do you think you bring as a woman telling stories?
Well, I think one of the things that emerged through the process of research and doing some of the interviews was this idea of Garry Winogrand, really kind of struggling to find his place in the world, just like how do we live in the world as human beings when it's so challenging, but also trying to find a balance between being an artist and being a parent. And that was something I could really identify with, just in my own life. And I also felt like this was something that you don't normally see discussed in films about men, right? The sort of cliche of male biography is like, oh, he was a terrible husband, a terrible dad, but who cares? You know, in this film, it really is like, well, he wasn't terrible, but he wasn't great either. And it was a source of pain for him. I mean, he really, really struggled with, particularly later in his life, with his daughter from his third marriage, who was only 8 when he died. He really struggled to figure out a way to have a kind of relationship with her that he wasn't quite able to have with his 2 older children.
He literally carried her around on his shoulders, and you would see her legs, like in some of the photographs and things, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
he couldn't stop photographing to be a dad, but he couldn't leave her behind.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. And you, Xan?
You know, I do a lot of branded content for Amazon, too, for their marketplace. So they hire me to do little portraits of people who sell there. So, you know, I made that film with Andrew a few years ago, but we'd been friends for a long time. That was our 4th project together. So I was actually interested in making something about the creative process that could be useful to others. And it's very intimately about him in many ways, but I wanted to make something more about, like, for someone who, I don't believe in genius, actually. I believe that everyone has access to a lot of things at different points in their lives. And so for him, I think, I made a film that's about an imbalance of when you're really particularly dialed into this kind of form of genius that you're tapping into, or I think, you know, it's almost like also an overdeveloped muscle that he had that created an imbalance in his life. You know, before studying filmmaking, I studied health and well-being, so I've always kind of framed the world in whether or not someone appears inhabited in their body and whether or not their lives are working for them, kind of the holistic picture of things. And so it's not like I zeroed in, was like, you're sick, we're making a movie about you being sick. It was just like, you know, I've noticed every time we talk, you're sick. But I also wanted to make this thing that's just about, like, what's it like to live this weird imbalance that is also temporary. And, you know, everybody, you know, the film premiered at New York, but it ran in 92 festivals all over the world. And the first question everyone would ask is he okay? And we're like, yeah, we ask you to do this very weird thing with documentaries, which is that we ask you to believe us for whatever amount of time you're watching for. You also have to accept it as a snapshot in time. And that's hard for the subject, it's hard for the maker, it's hard for the viewer, but you have to know that, like, everything changed after that. You know, like, he may have been sick a few times, but, like, his life is so different now. And I have the same thing when I do these little pieces for Amazon sometimes, or when people hire me, you know, to interview designers, and I do all that stuff now as freelance. And it's the same thing as, like, I approach them much more with humanity, not as in the frame of genius. It's not interesting to me, and I don't think it's a great commodity, you know? So, but in what everyone has and what dedication can bring to your interests or your hard work, I'm a big fan of hard work. And Andrew's an unbelievably resilient person.
You cannot get anywhere without hard work.
Yeah,
it's all
true.
about doing it and doing it and doing it and doing it, and that's how you get great at it.
Yeah.
And I think I'm just going to follow up on that to say I feel like it's a very, I think, kind of like distinctly feminist position to reject this idea of sort of the solitary, usually male genius, and to look at
doesn't help anybody.
Yeah, and to think about the work in relationship to sacrifice, right? Yeah. So in your film, to some extent, it's the sacrifice of his health.
Yeah.
And that makes him a more vulnerable character. And so, yeah, I'm totally.
And in yours, it's a sacrifice of his stability and his personal relationships, and sometimes it's not a willing sacrifice. That's the other thing. Mm-hmm. It's that they were driven, you know, back full circle, but we're driven to do these things.
And that's what Andrew says in the trailer too, is that he knows that he's chasing this thing, which is like being dialed in and chasing that sensation. When I do workshops with filmmakers or artists, you know, I always talk about how, like, you know, talent is one thing, genius or someone helping you is another thing, but your only longevity in any career is about your ability to rebuild after you make anything, even if you liked it or you didn't like it. Whether or not you try again is your career.
That's so funny because I have always said the success in life in general, your success is based upon your ability to change and to embrace change.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And to do that with the least amount of friction on your health and on your well-being, and to just kind of jump into
trying again
change,
is like falling in love again.
Constant.
Yeah.
What?
And trying again is like falling in love again. You're like, that was hard. I learned a lot. Do I want to do it again?
Yeah, I say to my mother every time I'm not gonna make, like, just shoot me if I make another documentary, you know? And then I'm like, oh, so I'm gonna make this documentary.
It's a terrible life choice.
It's terrible. It's totally irrational.
Yeah, that's true.
Anyway, on that note, thank you both so much for coming on.
Thank you so much, Andy.
And thank you all for being here.